So welcome everybody. This is Mike from Imperium Press. I have a very special guest with me today. We may or may not upload this as the 14th installment of the Imperium Cast, but Joel couldn't make it today. So I have with me an esteemed member of the nationalist movement. He's been in it for a long time. Just want to give a warm welcome to Froði Midjord. Froði, how are you?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm doing okay. I'm just, like probably everyone else, following the news updates about the war in Ukraine, which somewhat took me by surprise. So I guess that's what I've been doing the last couple of days, just looking at the news.
Yeah, as have we all. It took me by surprise a little bit as well. I made a very not a very confident prediction that the conflict would not happen, but of course it has now, and hindsight's 2020. And yeah, there's a lot of things are moving very quickly at this point. They're talking about disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, which I think is going to be a serious. Everyone's going to lose on that count, but we'll see what happens. We'll see. So today, what I wanted to do was to have you on to discuss the state of the, shall we say, the radical right or the nationalist movement, broadly speaking, because there's been a sort of dynamic in the nationalist movement that's been coming into focus. It was certainly there from the beginning, but the response to COVID has really accelerated this dynamic. And it kind of centers on the question of how do we effectively oppose this insane level of tyranny that's being imposed upon us. And the responses, I mean, there are more than two positions. There's a third, a fourth, a fifth position in all of this. But broadly speaking, I would say that the responses have started to fall into two camps. You could say on the one side, you've got libertarian camp, and on the other side, an authoritarian camp. And I'm not sure either one of them would really self-identify that way. It's kind of, I think, more what each side would characterize the other as. But that's I think as good a way of any of characterizing them. And the ultimate answer to this question, I think, how do we frame our opposition to COVID, will integrate those two positions, libertarian and authoritarian. But for the most part, for now anyway, the battle lines are being drawn between these two camps. And I thought that, it would be good to have like a frank discussion, not so much a debate about these positions, but just an open discussion about it. Not really trying to decide like which one's right or whatever, but more to set out what each position is kind of doing in the broader movement. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, even more interesting, I think, what I want to do is I kind of want to raise the broader issue of establishing a consensus or an orthodoxy within the nationalist right. So in other words, how much disagreement is healthy? What form should it take? I mean, right now, the debate doesn't seem to be very healthy. And going even deeper than that, I mean, I would like to get into issues of theory versus praxis. In other words, should ideology even precede practical action on the right, like it clearly does on the left? And I mean, this is not at all obvious, as much as we like our theory in nationalist circles. I mean, in some sense, how we got here is by a kind of civic nationalism. The idea that ideas themselves are the basis of coherent in-groups. So anyway, there's obviously deeper issues at play than just the COVID issue, important as that is, and how we respond to it. So I've been wanting for a long time to bring in a real veteran of the radical right, someone who has been in it for, a long time before there was an alt-right. And I could think of nobody better to speak on that than Froði. So I guess first, could you just kind of say a little bit about yourself, Froði? I think most of the audience will know who you are, but can you just kind of explain what it is that you've done and what you've been involved with?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good sort of range of topics that need to be discussed. As for myself, I have basically been in one capacity or another been involved with the radical right or nationalism since the 90s, since the late 90s. And but I've mostly been a public figure the way that I am now since around 2017. So I've been involved in other capacities before that. And my main two projects that I have been going is the Scanza Forum, which is a thing that I started in 2015, which is a series of conferences, I guess, that people in the Anglosphere, people in America and so on, will recognize things like AMRAN, the AMRAN conference, and so on. And it's a similar thing that we do in Scandinavia, in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And I've lost count of how many conferences I've organized at this point, but I have organized many, and I've had basically all the big names on the radical right as speakers, people like Ricardo Duchesne and Kevin MacDonald and Jared Taylor and Greg Johnson and Millennial Woes and others, a long list. And so we've done them in Scandinavia, in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And the reason I started with conferences is because I think that is the most important thing, that people get together in real life, and create social connections, because I object to the modern idea of human beings as rational calculating machines that basically you feed them information and arguments, and then they come up with the right conclusion, and that's how they form their political opinions or their beliefs. Because that's not true. I mean, if you just look at how the establishment responds when you say something that they don't approve of, they don't give you a list of arguments or a list of facts to refute your position and to ask you to reconsider. No, they attack you in a social manner. They attack your character, your reputation. They try to isolate you socially. They try to prevent you from having a job. And it's mostly a social form of attack. And so it's just not good enough that people read articles or read books on the internet. That's not good enough when you're attacked on a social level, because in the end, there's a risk that just becomes a form of escapism. And so I've always wanted to help people to network in the real world. And people have been coming to my conferences from all over the world, from America, from even, Europeans who live in Asia. And they've traveled from all over the world to attend these conferences. And we usually have a good time. We spend a weekend together in one of the Scandinavian capitals and, have discussions. But the most important part is the networking, is the, getting to know other people, because, a lot of people have met at events, my events or events like my events. Other people are doing the same thing, and they have formed bonds, and they have a real world connection. And that is how you build an organic living kind of community, because I think that's where we are, and we can get into that later. But I do think that one of the biggest challenges is to get away from having your whole existence in the metaverse. The metaverse isn't a new thing just because we're starting to talk about it now, because Zuckerberg started to talk about it. It's an old thing. People, one thing that I've said about COVID is that one of the sad aspects of COVID is that the lockdown situation didn't really change life all too much for some people. Some people were already living their whole life on the internet and isolated from other people. And that's not how we're supposed to live. That's not how we have evolved. That's not how we work. So the social connection and events, that has been that was my major thing before COVID started. Of course, travel restrictions and so on made it impossible to create conferences. And so in the last couple of years, I've spent more of my time on my other project, which is Guide to Culture, which is my channel where I do live streams, I do interviews, I do my own sort of podcasts where I talk about philosophy and so on. And I've never really attempted at a wide populist approach, trying to reach as many people as possible. I've always tried to reach intellectuals and sort of higher IQ people, not because I think they are better per se, or that I like them more or anything like that, but because they have a greater ability to impact how society works. I don't believe in the sort of the democratic model that it's the masses of people who change history. I think it's always minorities in one respect or another that change the course of history. And we have to get our intellectuals, people with resources and people with ideas and big brains on board if we want to change society. And so that has been my primary project since COVID started, because I couldn't do real world conferences. So that's why I have focused more on podcasts, that kind of information. And I've been quite active, actually. I did, I think 170 or over 170 episodes last year alone. And it's been growing. I've been reaching more and more people. And so that's where we are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I must say that, like, looking on from the sidelines, because I myself have only dove into being like somewhat of a public figure to whatever extent I am in recent years, but I've been looking on from the sidelines for many years on this. On our side of things. And I have to say that looking at, like, one of the things that I was most attracted to and thought that wouldn't that be great to get involved in is actually the Scanza forum itself, because I remember seeing, like, I devoured eagerly a lot of the content that came out of the Scanza forum and the speeches that had been recorded. At that time, there was a lot of the same guys that are still in it, but there was some others as well. And it was exhilarating to think of the idea of networking in real life and meeting some of these people that I really respected. And I think that that's a very, very important part of any sort of any vanguard movement is the real life connections. And it's just part of being a human. This is what we are. We're social creatures. We're not isolated, atomized individuals. And I think in some sense, the response to COVID has been, let's not toot our horn too much and say that, like, the reason why COVID tyranny is a thing is to shut down the alt-right or the dissident right. But I think in some sense, it is to shut down nationalism more broadly. Basically, what COVID has done has been to inaugurate a permanent state of exception, where the government basically can rewrite the law at any time to sort of gerrymander whatever it needs to happen to affect procedural outcomes in the way that will serve it to centralize its own power. And that's basically what has happened over the last couple of years. And I think that this is an idea that most of the people who are influential and whose opinions really are, think of them as thought leaders in the dissident right, I think that they would broadly agree with something like that. So yeah, it's terrible to see the direction that things have gone, but in a way, shutting down the social aspect of the movement and with the burgeoning in real life connections that were being made with things like the Scanza forum and others as well, has changed the sort of direction of where things are going. And it has, in fact, made it more of a vanguard type movement. I 100% agree with you that vanguardism is basically the only way that social change has ever come about, and that's really what we need to be doing. And the fact that we are not really able to meet up in real life or to do any sort of meet space organizing has changed us into more sort of a theoretical type movement. It's very hard to get these things going. There are some bright lights on the horizon. I think of something like the Asatru Folk Assembly, who have grown significantly throughout all the COVID restrictions and everything. And I tip my hat to those guys for that. But for the most part, it's been hard for nationalists to organize in real life. And of course, as you say, we've been living in the metaverse for a long time. So in a sense, things haven't changed all that much. I think for the man in the street, like Apollonian Germ posted a great video a little while ago where he basically said that people are already in the metaverse, and he cited a kind of a harrowing example of a family that went on a trip into the mountains that went horribly wrong, and basically every decision that the father made to kind of extricate the family from the situation went wrong, because he didn't sort of look around and see what was in front of his face. He wasn't sort of reading the signs of nature on the mountain. He was looking at maps and kind of like trying to work things out based on assumptions that are very much abstractly removed from the situation. And unfortunately, that is where we are at as a species. We're kind of moving more in this direction, whereas and are sort of at an animal level, humans are social and irrational creatures that we need that in real life connection. So I would have loved to have attended one of these Scanza conferences, but unfortunately we had to sort of take a tack in another direction. But before we get into the kind of the more deeper stuff to do with theory and praxis and all of that, I wonder if you can just kind of tell me a little bit, like, give me your take here on the sort of give me the bird's eye view from a veteran in the scene on where the radical right kind of is and where it's moving, and how it's changed since you got started in this in the 90s.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that video by Apollonian Germ. I don't know him. I don't know his stuff. And that's actually the only video I've seen by him. I thought it was really good. I thought it was an excellent point that very much is in line with my own observations about what's going on, that people have. People live on artificial input alone. They don't really get input from the real world anymore. As for your question, the bird's eyes view, well, I think that we can see a change in the medium, right? The medium is the message, right? That the way we communicate with each other and the way things work has really changed how the entire right works. If you think in the 90s, there was very little in form of video or podcasts or things like that. It was the written word. It was text, right? So you could go in and order. There was no really internet. Internet existed. The internet existed in the 90s, in the late 90s, but it wasn't used nearly to the same extent as it is today. So people had to actively go in and order a magazine, a journal, or a book or something, and that's the way they got information. And the information was mostly in the written word. And so you communicate ideas, right? And I'll get more into that later. But that was how it was. And that obviously puts a pretty strict limit on how many people you can reach, because you have to depend on their agency. They have to go in and order this material and read it and then be convinced. It's a very sort of slow kind of way of reaching people. And it's a very impersonal way of reaching people, because you basically reach them in the abstract, on the level of just words written on a page. So that's in the 90s. And one thing that did exist, and that was really sort of a pioneering kind of thing, and that was William Pierce's American Dissident Voices, which I've always recommended, and I still continue to recommend, something that he started, a sort of a local radio channel in America. He started it in the 70s and did it up until his death in the early 2000s, in 2002. And those things are obviously still recorded, and they were available on cassettes and so on in the 90s and 80s. And so that was a radio station, and I think that is probably the one thing that was modern about the right back then. That and still, it was an old man who did it, and so that affected how he was talking and his style and so on. But still, it was a radio station. It was more personal than the written word. So that is one stage in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then in the early 2000s, mid 2005, around there, that's when people started doing blogs. So, when the internet became more active and people started blogging, and that started a quicker kind of more immediate kind of communication, because rather than sending something to the press and printing a magazine, and you get a new thing maybe once a month or once every 2 months, and go around selling it to people or something like that, you get an immediate thing, you post it right away. And so it's a more immediate kind of communication. It's still the written word, but it's more personal because it's more immediate and people start commenting. And I think that had a great impact of reaching new people as well. And then the next stage, which I think is probably the next big stage, is in the early 2010s, when people started doing podcasts very much like this. Because one thing that you have to understand, and some people understand it, some people don't understand it, is the 3 levels of communication that have been discussed all the way back to ancient rhetoric, all the way back to Aristotle, really is, and Cicero and all the writers in the ancient world, is ethos, pathos, and logos, right? And the right tends to be a bit autistic and focus almost exclusively on the logos, on the logic, on the ideas. If you present, and this is kind of counterintuitive in a way, or paradoxical in a way, because the right pretends to be sort of anti-modern, but that kind of thinking is extremely modern, that you just rely on arguments and logic, and that's how you're going to win people over, because that's not really how it works. And so I would say that the start of podcasting in the early 2010s, that is the major step, the first big major step into the direction of making a right or a nationalist movement that is more personal. Because instead of the written word, the sort of clinical, sterile communication of the written word, you get a more personal thing. You get a person there. And that's why I bring up this the ancient classical rhetoric division of the communication into 3 modes of logos and pathos and ethos. And you can communicate logos and even pathos in the written word, but ethos is really your personality, and that's really where most of the communication takes place. It takes place on the level of personality. And that's really something that comes out in social media. People follow individuals or a personality that they find interesting, and doesn't really matter what you say because it's really about, can I relate to this person or not? And, that brings us back to, what does the left do when they try to discredit us? They don't give us arguments. They say that this is a despicable person, immoral, try to harm your reputation and so on, because they don't want people to relate to you. So I think that was a major change. And with podcasting was a big thing. And then, of course, the next step was the sort of the YouTube generation, where people like Millennial Woes, for example. The thing that I told him when we started talking back in 2017, I guess, is that this is a form of communication that is completely on the level of ethos. It's a personality. You don't have to talk about political theory anymore. This is a person that people can relate to him, because he talks about his own problems and all kinds of things like that, and it's just a person that other people can relate to. And so this is that was a new thing, really. From my point of view, that is a new thing on the right, that all of a sudden, instead of just having this rather autistic way of communicating with just logic and just a sterile clinical written word, you all of a sudden had you had personalities out there. and you had like a flesh and blood human being that other people could relate to, and that is a game changer for communication completely. And I think, you know, that's obviously why the sort of mainstream big platforms understood that they needed to shut that down, because you can't have people out there that are relatable and other people can relate to them and who are not following the accepted paradigm in how you're supposed to talk about politics and values and so on. So that was really those are really some major steps in how you know, the communication on the right has changed, and I think that also automatically changed the kind of person who was attracted to the right. And we can get into some of the sort of psychological traits. I had an interview with Kevin McDonald and Ricardo Duchesne last night, and we were talking about the psychology of the left versus the psychology of the right. And, you know, the left has its own problems with psychological traits that are sort of overrepresented among them. But the right definitely also has problems with certain psychological traits. And some of them are, you know, the sort of more antisocial, more individualistic personalities. And that was definitely even more true in the past, because you didn't really have a human normal connection. You just had the clinical word on the page. Whereas if you put out a more human face to the whole message, that will attract another personality type. So I do think that although, you know, we still have, you know, our problems on the right, things have gotten a lot better. So I mean, the bird's eye view that you asked for, I think that, you know, some major characteristics of the change that has happened is the mode of communication. So we have gotten to a more sort of well-versed mode of communication now, where we have a human face, a human voice, and things that people can relate to. That has also made it possible to reach new people, more people, because you don't depend on their agency of, you know, going in and putting an envelope in the mailbox and ordering a book or something. They can just access information anywhere. And so we've obviously reached a lot more people, and the quality of people has in some ways gone up as well. That, you know, because it isn't so difficult to get hold of this information, you reach more people, and automatically you also reach people who are more relaxed and casual about things, and aren't as, you know, sort of subcultural or marginalized in society. You get the more sort of normal people. And to be frank, that's what you need as well. I mean, I'm elitist, but I also believe that in order to change anything, you need to reach the normal people, not the sort of fringe people who are interested in fringe things, but you have to reach the sort of the average person as well. So those are some of the ways that things have changed, I would say, to the better. There's one way that things have changed to the worse, and I think that is also connected with technology, and that is a sort of a lack of seriousness. That although we had, you know, there were strange personalities in earlier decades, they were dedicated in a way. You know, they saw their mission as a form of a religious task, right? You can think of things like the Order in America in the 80s, and I don't, you know, I just want to make sure that I don't recommend that anyone follow their example. I think that those who are alive of those men themselves would recommend that no one follows their example. But my point is that they were dedicated. They were like, you know, jihadis it was a holy war for them. And it was sort of a sacred thing and the most important thing in the world. And they didn't take it casually. I think that when things have become, you know, you have easier access to information and you can remain anonymous, you can be online and be on a forum. And I think that has created a culture of less seriousness and more sort of casual fakery and casual nihilism, lazy nihilism. I like to call it lazy nihilism. You can just pretend to be radical because there are no costs involved, right? It's like a video game, right? It's the right has become to some extent a video game where you log on to whatever forum you use, or wherever you communicate with people, and you have created this sort of persona, and this persona is radical, and it has nothing to do with your real life. I call this the nationalist Narnia, right? And that's what I often talk about on my channel, that this is sort of it's a part of the metaverse. It's a nationalist Narnia. And so you entered the nationalist Narnia, and you vent your views there, and you can sort of, your online video game character is very radical, and but in real life you're just a normie. And I mean, this is disconnected from the person that you are in real life. And so in the same way that, you can play, well, I don't play video games, so I don't even know what they're called, but you can play a video game where you are some brave knight or something, Game of Thrones. You can pretend that you're a character in Game of Thrones, and you have this exciting life, and it's sort of an artificial existence. And that's where you can vent all these attitudes, but it has nothing to do with who you are in real life. And it's the same thing with the nationalist Narnia. It has become a form of escapism. And so a lot of people have this sort of artificial radical persona that exists only online. And it's their video game. It's their dream. They can be whatever they want. So they can purity spiral and everything. But it comes with no obligations in real life. It comes with, it's disconnected with how you live your actual life. And so in a sense, although the movement has grown in the sense that you reach a lot more people, I mean, comparing a magazine that was published in the 90s and maybe reached 500 people, 200 people, or, a few hundred, with YouTube channels that reach 500,000 viewers, right? It's a game changer, of course. But there's also a change in how serious it all is. And, I've said that, just saying that nationalism is on the rise just because people are, watching something online is sort of like saying that the birth rates are going up because, more people are watching Pornhub or something like that. It's sort of, no, it's sort of a substitute, and that's the risk I'm talking about. I'm not saying that it's a necessarily that way, but I'm saying there's a risk that the online existence becomes a substitute for what happens in real life, and then it actually becomes a problem rather than a useful tool. So I think those are some of the major ways that the right or the nationalist movement has changed over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, that is a good broad overview. I think a lot of that rings very true. And just to touch on kind of where you ended up there in your description, I agree that there is a problem, sort of a problem on 2 counts. There's a problem of too much seriousness in the wrong things, and too little seriousness toward the right things. As you coined it, the nationalist Narnia is a big problem. There's too many people who are sort of, it's a substitute for Xbox or something. They can log on to their Twitter account or their Telegram account, and I hate to use the word LARP because I hate the term, but it kind of applies here. There's too little skin in the game with some of the direction things have gone with social media and everything. On the other hand, there are some people who are extremely serious about, issues kind of peripheral to the nationalist right that need to be purged. And, I have in mind here what you've been saying in the last couple of months with incels being a poison, a sort of blight on our circles, and that these people do need to be purged. So on the one hand, there's a kind of winnowing going on. On the one hand, we're getting rid of the unserious people, who are just in it for for the lulls, and on the other hand, we're getting rid of the serious people who are seriously committed to something that's destructive. And it's important to cultivate this sort of middle ground, so to speak, or the sweet spot where to cultivate these committed beliefs to the right things, to genuine nationalism, and not civic nationalism, but real nationalism. There was a study that went around recently on Telegram, I think, where it was basically saying that once 10%, or might have been less, might have been like 5%, a very small percentage of the population has an unshakable and committed belief in something, that basically this belief starts to dominate the culture, and it's just a matter of time before it does. And this is a problem. This is a problem for the wider liberal society, because nobody really genuinely, not nobody, but people are increasingly falling away from a genuine belief in liberalism. But kind of circling back to your description here of the way that things have kind of changed, it's interesting because I've been sort of on the road, shall we say, to nationalism since about 2013 or so, and it wasn't long before I was on that track. And I do remember with Web 2.0, when that sort of came along, with the blogosphere and all of that came along, it basically started accelerating everything in every direction. It was like the Overton window started expanding in every which way, because there was this feedback loop between creator and audience, where audience participation and just literal feedback, and where the creator is able to hear what the audience thinks in the comments section, everything like that. Things started to expand very quickly, and this was very conducive to, I think it's good to use the tripartite Greek conception from Aristotle: logos, ethos, and pathos. That's very conducive at that point to the expansion of the sort of logos-related, logocentric dynamic, where it was the sort of rise of. I don't think it is accidental that at that time you got a sort of the rise of new atheism and this kind of almost, shall we say, autistic focus on argumentation and everything. And you're right, it's something very modern. And then later on, with the rise of YouTube comes along YouTube personalities, and personality starts to dominate the argumentation, right? I think somebody like a Millennial Woes is a great example of somebody who appeals to ethos very much, because the strength of, he's got many strengths, but one of his best strengths is that he's a normal and likable guy. And that's very dangerous for the other side to see in nationalist circles. And then right around the same time, we get the rise of the alt-right, so to speak. And here I think we get the pathos entering into the equation with meme culture. Meme culture being something that is very much hits you kind of like at the gut level, where it's pre-rational. It appeals to something in us that is not given to argumentation, and it's at this time here where the rise of the alt-right, and I'm not talking about sort of like in the later stages, 2017, 18. I'm talking more right around the time that Trump entered into his put his hat in the ring for the U.S. election. At this point in time, something interesting was kind of happening in the broader dissident right, shall we say. It was kind of a confederacy. It was like a big tent movement. And I actually kind of regard this as in some ways a kind of golden age, even though we were less effective in some ways and more effective in others. But there was a kind of confluence of like ethno-nationalists and the manosphere and the HBD crowd and reactionaries and everything that was kind of hard to beat. That this big tent, I think, was very effective. And most of the damage it did, to the mainstream narratives, I think, was in this phase, the alt-right. One of the things that was really effective about it is it kind of formed this target that was a little bit too wide for the mainstream to deal with effectively. So, I mean, if like CNN starts yelling about white supremacy, I think normal people are actually kind of on board with that. They do agree that they don't like that sort of thing. But if CNN starts going on these estrogen fueled tirades about white supremacy and white privilege and patriarchy and transphobia and Christian nationalism and all these things, it just makes them look hysterical. So this is, I think, we're involved in an asymmetrical battle against a foe who kind of holds all the cards. One of the ways that is very effective here is to give normal people a way in, multiple ways in. So it's not just, I think later on when the alt-right kind of changed into something that was very much more stridently white nationalist, it was far less effective, not just because it was more, deplatformed and everything, but because it was just, there was less appeal to that. And yeah, there was also sort of, again, the way that these different sides, like the ethno-nationalists and reactionaries and manosphere and all, they kind of checked each other, and there was a sort of grand debate that was going on between them. I found very, very interesting, and it was a lot less, it was a lot less rancorous than it is today. And in some ways, we're kind of coming back to that now that we're a little bit, well, not a little bit, that we're quite ghettoized. We've been, many of the prominent personalities have been kicked off the platforms. I myself have been kicked off of Twitter. Many of us have been kicked off of YouTube. We're all kind of crammed together in, more deep, dank, and dark corners of the internet. There's a kind of bottleneck that's been happening. And again, we're kind of getting back into this debate phase where we're starting to debate what it is that really makes nationalism. And at this point, I think it would be good to, going back to what I said in the beginning about how we're getting these kind of sides that are starting to emerge on the nationalist scene, broadly, let's just say libertarian and authoritarian and maybe some others. I think it would be good to sort of go into the situation that happened recently on Telegram and elsewhere, where you posted a video that I actually really liked about using liberal arguments against liberals. And I think this video kind of set off a reaction on the different sides that really showed kind of how things are getting a little bit polarized in the nationalist scene. So can you maybe summarize just very, very quickly what you were saying in that video, and give your take on sort of where things went from there, and how you see this kind of debate going on?
Absolutely. First of all, I should say that the video was, there were some words that were sort of disputed, right? I mean, some people talked about bodily autonomy, and that's something that I've never talked about. But that video was specifically, Morgoth asked me, what would you say if someone said this, right? So the question was about bodily autonomy and claiming that if you object to vaccine mandates or other kinds of oppressive elite practices, that's a liberal stance. Well, how would you respond to that? So that's the premise. That's the background of the video. Wasn't because I had talked about bodily autonomy. What I've talked about is the principle of informed consent and so on. But with regard to liberalism, I think we should take a step back and we should talk about what liberalism is. And I think some of the people who have sort of complained that this is liberalism or whatever, I think they have a somewhat it's sort of a paradoxical view of liberalism, because liberalism and ideologies in themselves are not sort of free-floating ideas that ideas or arguments or reason is this sort of entity in itself that just floats around and then latches on to individuals, and individuals are these abstractions, and they can sort of understand an argument, and they can accept an argument and believe in an ideology and so on. That in itself is a liberal idea. that's an idea that sort of is very Enlightenment, very liberal in itself. I don't believe that is how arguments work or how politics works. I think politics is more biological or more inherent, if you like. I recently just made, last night actually, I recorded this last episode of my conversation with Kevin MacDonald and Ricardo Duchesne about Kevin MacDonald's book, Individualism and the Western Liberal Tradition. And basically that whole book is about how biology and sort of heritable traits in Northern Europeans interacted with Christianity and some other sort of historical trends to create what is liberalism today. And so essentially liberalism is a value system. And I'm not talking about liberalism as sort of a specific doctrine that someone has written about in a book. I'm talking about a set of values, very broadly speaking, about things like individualism, things like relative egalitarianism, things like individual liberties, and things like self-determination and stuff like that. And those sets of values and that set of values or that set of ideas is simply something that exists in Northern Europeans. And Northern Europeans, and this is liberalism, Northern Europeans have tried to universalize that, have tried to say that, well, our values should be the values of the entire world, right? This is something that I've been talking about as well. You know, people say that you're not supposed to say that liberals are the real racist, but there's something inherently extremely chauvinistic about the idea that, well, this is our set of values, but we're supposed to make sure that everyone in the entire world shares them. So that is sort of the imperialistic, chauvinistic attitude that liberals have. And, you know, one thing that I've quoted many times is this thing from Full Metal Jacket, where one of the characters says that we're here to help the Vietnamese because inside every is an American trying to get out, right? Is that we're saving the entire world by trying to turn them into carbon copies of ourselves. But that's not really how these ideologies work. I think that different people evolve. It's sort of political systems or political values emerge out of people rather than the other way around. It's not just rational arguments floating around and then sort of attaching themselves to individuals who are sort of these abstract units. That is the sort of the liberal way of looking at it. Liberal values. It's something that is most definitely very Northern European, and so in the post-war era, since the World War II, we have gone into a very sort of liberal phase where these liberal values, there's a liberal sort of hegemony in the West, most certainly, that these are the values that make a society legitimate. Right? So it's because we have a liberal democracy with an open society where you're allowed to criticize the government and you have these individual liberties. That is why we are a legitimate society. That is the narrative. That has been the narrative in the post-war era. So since World War II, that has definitely been the narrative that's the only thing that makes a society legitimate. And that's why we have to save these people in Russia, or, that's why Saddam Hussein is bad or Gaddafi is bad, because they don't have liberal democracy like we do. And that's why we are legitimate. They have no legitimacy. That's the narrative. But there's a problem there for the establishment. And the problem is this, that they also want replacement level migration. So they want a society where fewer people are Northern Europeans of Northern European descent in America, for example. And so you have a situation where the people who are the necessary condition, the necessary prerequisite for having a liberal society, they are becoming a minority. And as you're getting fewer whites, you're going to get less liberalism. That's very predictable if you understand how liberalism emerged from a population. And it isn't just sort of an abstraction that came out of nowhere and people started believing in it. No, it emerged out of a certain population. And when that population disappears, that set of values will also disappear from society. And so it's very predictable that American society, for example, will go in the direction of, considering, I know we're going to, I have to be careful about what I say, but considering the people who are at the top now, the new elite, predictably society will go more in the direction of the Soviet Union hard totalitarianism at the top. And considering the sort of massive proletariat that is in American society now, you will see more of a sort of African-style chaos, really, at the bottom, with just lots of violence and breakdown of social norms and so on, and civil society. And so you get a very, very nasty kind of society, actually. But the problem for the elite is that they will want to continue having they will want to continue this society under the legitimacy of liberalism, quote unquote. And so they will want to pretend that, well, it's still a liberal society, although you have these show trials, these sort of Soviet-style show trials, of which we saw several last year in America, high-profile show trials for political purposes. The sort of you have a two-tier legal system with America and BLM burning down the countries and getting a slap on the wrist, while the people who were casually walking into the Capitol on January 6th, they get treated worse than Muslim terrorists in America. And so you have a complete breakdown of liberal values. And essentially what I want to point out, what I was trying to point out with my video, was that if people say, well, you're appealing to liberal norms with your arguments, I would say, yeah. I'm talking to Northern Europeans. I'm saying that these norms, we're pretending that we're living in this kind of society that is liberal, but we're actually moving into a post-liberal society where those values are not going to exist anymore. And they're not going to exist anymore because our society is changing demographically, and the people who value those values, the people who care about those values, are going away. And they're being replaced by other people who don't give a damn, quite frankly, about such values, individual freedoms, and so on. And you have to point that out. You have to, the establishment would like nothing more than to continue in the direction of a very sort of Soviet-style totalitarian society, ideological totalitarian society that's very repressive, but under the cover of liberalism and the open society. And what I pointed out quite simply in that video is that, when this transformation is happening, we should call it out. We should make sure that people understand and that they don't get away with lying and pretending that, well, this is still a liberal society. No, we've moved into a new phase. We've moved into a new type of society that is more oppressive and less open. And we're talking about a difference in degrees here, but it's just going to get worse. It's just going to get worse. And we have to call attention to that. And the other thing that I was essentially trying to convey with that video is that, well, we're hardwired. Northern Europeans are hardwired to accept such arguments. And, there's a tendency on the right to sort of, I've called this sort of having a bit of solipsism, right? It's like having an inner monologue in public, that you're not actually talking to anyone. You're just having your inner monologue out loud, and you don't really care who you talk to. Well, if you care who you talk to, Northern Europeans are hardwired to accept these arguments. Well, should you avoid using them? No, I don't think that's good advice. So those are some of the things that I wanted to convey with that video. And I do think that we are, and that's something that I've been talking about a lot on my channel as well, that this idea of, we're moving into post-liberalism, and liberalism has sort of abolished itself, that liberalism wants to pretend in sort of individual abstractions and, that there are no differences between people. But in fact, liberalism depends on the people it is trying to abolish. And so liberalism is abolishing itself in that way. And that's why we're moving into this uh, harder type of totalitarian society, because those people are no longer in control of society, the people who care about liberal values.
Yeah, very much so. And this is why this kind of goes to the heart of why I wanted to have you on and what I wanted to talk about here, because ultimately I agree that we should call out the rank hypocrisy of liberals. They talk about things like Popper's paradox, where, you should not tolerate intolerance. But really what this is, finally, at the end of the day, is a contradiction. It's not a paradox. It's kind of like that Oscar Wilde quote where he says that he can, I can resist anything except temptation. And it's like somebody took that and forgot that it was a joke or something, like they take this sort of contradiction deadly seriously. And this is absurd, and it's absolutely right for us to call that out. And I posted a response that was not really directed particularly at what you had said, and it was not, I certainly didn't mean to impute that you had, defending bodily autonomy or anything like that. But basically, the sort of gist of my response was that we should be careful. We should be careful with taking these arguments fully seriously, using liberal arguments against liberals, because there is a kind of dual aspect to liberalism, one aspect of which has been completely discarded, and the other aspect of which is alive and well. The one side of it that's been discarded is what most people would kind of think of as classical liberalism. That's the kind of parliamentarian ethos of, pluralism and openness and debate, and the idea that, minorities can't agree on first principles, so they need to come together and sort of hash it all out in this open forum. That's the aspect of liberalism that's dead and gone, and these liberals seem to not want to bring that back for obvious reasons, because they will lose. But there's another side to liberalism as well that is, I think, very much alive and is very dangerous, and that we should avoid. And that is, I think you touched on this here, which is the idea of taking man as an abstraction and sort of drawing conclusions from that. And this is something I think that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment, where you get an Immanuel Kant, who's trying to deduce the categories of reason by essentially stripping away all the particularity of the subject. And this is a classic liberal move, and this is exactly what's happening with wokeness. It's kind of the bedrock of transhumanism, and you can see it in even mid-century, like in John Rawls, whose idea of the I forget what it's called, but the original position is effectively man stripped of all context. This is an aspect of liberalism that continues, and it's this aspect that I think that Kevin MacDonald is really tackling head on when he talks about, like, in his book on individualism. And I have been listening to your podcast there. I would recommend everybody subscribe to you on Gumroad, because this is really, like, if you're not in this debate, if you're not sort of like in this discussion about what you are calling the hard problem of decline, then most of the rest is just kind of nibbling around the edges. Most of the rest is just sort of like how we get, practically, how do we gain power or whatever. Well, what we need to understand at a deeper level is how we got here, why it is that we're in decline as well. And I think that what Kevin MacDonald is saying, there's a very deep truth to this here, and Ricardo Duchesne as well, as to who we are at a very archaic level. But I would sort of add my little bit to this here and say that the kind of entropic, imperious, universalist liberalism is actually not who we are, not even at that deepest level as Indo-Europeans. There is an archaic liberalism that there's not an accident that as Northwestern Europeans, we are we turned into shit libs. But there is a kind of formulation of that was much more healthy, and I'll just kind of lay it out here. I want to get your takes on things. This is not my platform to sort of get these things across, but I think you might find this interesting. So the originary Indo-European religion, best as we could tell, was something purely domestic. It was a kind of form of ancestor worship where each family, each clan worshipped its ancestors and traced its lineage to the high gods. And this religion was ultra-particularist. So each family's gods wanted worship from the family alone, not from the neighbors or anything like that. And each family kind of jealously guarded its gods. There was no proselytism. This was unthinkable to even down into the classical period. So the house father, or the high priest of the family, who conducted the rites, he recognized no authority that was higher than his own ancestors. So in other words, nobody could tell him how to practice his rites. There was no external authority who trumped the family's own ancestors. The house father was a little absolute monarch. He was like the high priest. He was the supreme judge of his family. He was the commander of chief in war. And there is a Latin phrase that came down in the classical period, suo quisque ritus sacrificia faciat. And what this means is, let each man make the sacrifices according to his own right. And this was echoed in a kind of, I think, a racial memory later on in the absolutist period, cuius regio eius religio, which means whoever's kingdom, his religion. And I think in this, we see a sort of great grandfather to the individual who's sovereign over himself, or the king who's above the law, the essence of absolutism. This is the house father. He is this proto-individual, this in a way, a proto-liberal, really. But the modern kind of atomized individual doesn't make any sense within the logic of this ancestor cult that I've laid out here. This is something a little bit different. The Indo-European household was a corporative unit. Like the house father, yes, he was an absolute monarch, but he was part of an inseparable whole. The family and the clan and all that. This was the basic unit of society, not the individual. So, the whole was kind of ontologically prior to the part to these people. And this is where we get the idea of the sovereignty of the ancestors over the house father, right? No one could tell the house father how to perform his rites, but he inherits these rights from his forefathers. So in other words, we get really what is a kind of great grandfather to fascism as well. And the basic idea of this is that the state, or the folk, or in this case, the family or clan, is the fundamental unit of society. And this is actually much closer to National Socialism than it is to an Italian fascism, since National Socialism is anti-universalist and regards each folk as kind of a discrete unit. So anyway, the point here is that even like diametric opposites, like liberalism and fascism, were kind of originally one thing. And it would be a mistake for us to see them as totally irreconcilable. And of course, as much as liberalism arose among Northwestern Europeans, let's not forget, so too did absolutism. This was something that arose in France and England and Germany. Fascism itself, like of course Italian fascism in the Mediterranean, but Northern Europeans certainly had their own fascisms as well. And I think really what's happening here, the sort of crux of the problem is the liberal attempt to kind of shoehorn this sovereign individual into a psychology that goes back to high antiquity. The idea of every man a king of his castle, that is the house father, suo quisque, and all that, to each his own. It doesn't fit when you take away this corporative idea of how the society fits together and what the basic unit of society is. When the basic unit of society is the individual and not the clan or the family, you get this runaway individualism, this basically the road to liberalism. So anyway, that's just kind of what I've been thinking, because I have been listening to your podcasts with Ricardo Duchesne and Kevin McDonald very eagerly. And I think that this is like the problem. We need to be working on this. And if we're not working on this, none of the other stuff matters. So yeah, with regard to the, to each his own, if that's kind of like where our psychology is rooted, we kind of need to think about how something coherent can be welded out of this, especially in the current milieu of the nationalist right, because there's so much disagreement that seems to be going on between all the different factions. So, we need to think. I would put it to you, Froði, how can a political movement maintain unity while leaving room for healthy disagreement?
Yeah, I just want to say that, yeah, I agree. This is the big problem and the difficult problem, and that's why I did this very sort of in-depth conversation with Kevin MacDonald and Ricardo Duchesne about the book Individualism and the Western Liberal Tradition, because I do believe that it's Kevin MacDonald's most important book. I mean, a lot of people care about the culture of critique, and that's also a good book, but in a way, Culture of Critique deals with the easy problem, and the other book deals with the hard problem. And I think that's also why it has gotten so little attention, because it is a much more difficult topic. You have to think, you have to dig down into the material, and it's not easy, and that's why you have to really take it slowly and actually try to convey the ideas. And did you want to say something?
No, I was just agreeing with you. I think it is probably his most important book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to convey any sort of suggestion that of determinism, right? That we're determined to end up in this sort of crazy liberal or post-liberal society just because we're Northern Europeans. I mean, and this is something that Kevin MacDonald is also sort of strawmanned into being some sort of biological determinist, which he is not. I mean, all his books deal with culture, the importance of culture. The only difference between him and other people is that he deals with how culture connects with sort of evolutionary preconditions, right? So the point is that we already had, for example, to talk about just Christianity a bit, the reason he brings up individualism and Christianity is that, we had a relatively individualist culture in the North before Christianity. It's like from the Stone Age, we have evolved a relatively, and it's important to stress the word relatively individualist, because we weren't absolute individualists by no means at all. It's just that if you compare to the Middle East or even to the Mediterranean, the countries there, that Northern Europeans were more individualist, but they still had tribal structures, kinship structures in society that kept society going. And his whole point is that when you added the ideological, metaphysical individualism of Christianity to this already existing structure of evolved individualism, then you get a hyper individualism, and that is how we got liberalism. So it's not that just Northern European genes or something by themselves create this kind of liberalism. No, it is a combination. You're reinforcing. It's sort of like giving an alcoholic just more and more to drink, right? It sort of drives it in a pathological direction. And so by no means are we hardwired to just end up here, or determined that there's a sort of a deterministic thing going on here, that we have no choice in the matter. Absolutely not. And I think this is something that Ricardo Duchesne said as well in our latest recording, that this is how postmodernism emerged. That you had these liberals or leftists, Marxists, started off taking their own theories seriously, and they really believed in the tabula rasa of human beings, right? That we can just turn everyone into anything because it's the tabula rasa. It's the blank slate. We can write whatever we want on that blank slate. And as reality resisted their project, they had to come up with ways of getting around that. And so they just came up with postmodernism. And that's just suspending all rules, that, okay, anything goes, we don't have to take anything from reality into consideration, because we can just create these huge circular arguments, and that's just as good as sort of empirical evidence. And so they created these crazy theories as a huge cope, really, because it turned out that their original theories, which they actually probably believed in, turned out to be wrong. And how to deal with that? Well, you just suspend all rules of argument and all rules of science and so on. And so you create postmodernism. So that's a huge cope. And that's because liberalism as a theory broke down. And as far as your question goes with how to create a form of unity, well, one thing that I've been saying for many years is that what unifies the right isn't so much what it's in favor of, but what it is against. So in that sense, the Marxists are kind of right in saying that the right is reactionary. We're sort of reacting to what the left is doing. The left has all the agency, and we're just reacting to it. The only thing we know is that we don't like what's going on. And that's sort of what unifies the right. I mean, we have pagans, we have Christians, Catholics, Protestants, even some Orthodox people, and National Socialists. We have a sort of a libertarian component on the right. And they all agree, basically, that they don't like what's going on in society. And so I without any form of ideological orthodoxy, which I don't really think is possible at this point, I think we have to be satisfied with that. I think we have to settle. I mean, if we're going to cooperate with people who have a different ideology, then we have to accept that the only thing we agree on is the problems. And in a sense, that's good enough, because what we disagree on is mostly theoretical, but what we agree on is more of the things that are actually going on in the world around us. And what I mean by that is that, the entire right taken in a sort of wider meaning, right? And that doesn't include things like, Republicans or something, but a more kind of dissident right or radical right. We agree pretty much on which things in society, which actual things going on in society we think are good and which things we think are bad. The only things we disagree on is the sort of the theoretical parts of what we would like instead and so on. But I think that if we can agree on which things are good and which things are bad of the things that are going on in reality, I think that's a pretty good foundation for a sort of a cooperation. But there is a problem. There is a difficulty for cooperation, and that also comes out in my latest conversation with Kevin MacDonald and Ricardo Duchesne, and that is the psychology of the right. Because one thing that we did discuss is the left has a certain traits that are problems, they have their own kinds of sort of mental illnesses and so on, and they happen to be wrong about their analysis of the world, but they're able to create things because they have a kind of a pro-social personalities, in the sense that they're able to cooperate around things, and they have they have higher conscientiousness and so on, whereas the right is on the opposite end. And, it's people have talked about organizing the right in terms of herding cats. That's the old cliche. But the problem is that the right is higher on sociopathy. And so that is, it's sort of a hardwired trait in the right, and especially because you will be socially attacked if you are public with your right-wing views. That means that, people who are higher in conscientiousness, they need to get social approval, they will avoid the right, and the people who will speak up will be and we're talking about degrees here, it's not black and white, but they will tend to be higher on sociopathy, and that just creates problems for organizing anything, because you have lower levels of pro-social behavior, have higher levels of antisocial behavior, and that is a huge problem on the right. That's a huge problem on the right. So, I mean, we shouldn't kid ourselves into, like I said before, we shouldn't kid ourselves into believing in the liberal version of politics as arguments, politics as abstractions. We have to think in terms of who are the people that we're talking to, who are the people that we're dealing with, and just as liberal values come out of a Northern European personality type or a Northern European population, in the same way, certain problem with antisocial behavior come out of the current edition, at least, of the right, because we're now marginalized. If you have a more mainstream right, then you'll have lower levels of that problem. But yeah, in addition to the theoretical disagreements, I think we have a hardwired problem as well, and that is probably going to be even more difficult to deal with.
Yep. No, it certainly is. It's interesting that you mentioned the psychology of the right wing, because we had a book come out at the beginning of 2021 by Josh Neal called American Extremist, where the book is an extended, like he basically puts liberalism on the table, on the couch, and examines it from a psychological perspective. And what he finds is that liberalism is basically extremism raised to the power of an ideology, and that generates both left extremism and right extremism. And what I thought was great about this book is that Josh doesn't spare right extremists at all. There's just about as much space devoted to the extremists on our side as there is on the left side. And he certainly does come to the conclusion that sociopathy is a major problem for us. Now, interestingly, I think he sees it as a problem as well for the left, but that it expresses itself in different ways. I mean, the TLDR here is that for the left, let's just say for our side, sociopathy expresses itself as anal retentive to the extreme, versus on the left, it's what he calls anal expulsive, which I think is a great term and very illustrative of what the left does. But there's definitely an aspect to it on our side where, as you say, it is a matter of herding cats. Everybody, the left does make some real decent critiques, or at least honest critiques of us. And I think one of them is the idea that everybody wants to be the king. Everybody wants to sort of be the thought leader. And you can kind of see a lot of this going on our side. I think this individualism is inherent in some sense to Northwestern Europeans, as you say. What we had kind of in the archaic period, or ancestrally, is a qualified individualism. It's not really individualism, in the same sense that we have it today. The notion of freedom or the free individual is cognate in the Germanic languages to friend. And this kind of derives from an Indo-European root, prios, which has Slavic and Indo-European cognates that mean dear to. So the idea is that it connotes ideas of like personal belonging and clan affiliation and ownership and things like that. So in a sense, freedom to the ancient Germanic peoples meant something almost opposite to what it means today, where now freedom means essentially being untethered from all these social obligations. But and I think that Christianity has something to do with how this has changed. This is not to blame Christianity per se, but just to say that it kind of unbalanced what was a finely balanced dynamic in the first place. It's just a fact now, though, that over the course of a number of centuries, this change has happened, and we are more individualistic as Northwestern Europeans. So yeah, you're right. We do have to take a more pragmatic stance to grow the movement.
I just want to add something, if I can.
Sure.
About individualism, and I think this is very important, that the individualism that we're talking about now with respect to sort of the right and so on, with antisocial personality traits, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the evolved individualism in the North, because that's sort of the opposite almost. The individualism that we're talking about now, the sort of immoral individualism that you don't really care about anyone else, you are antisocial and you're unable to cooperate. That is the opposite of the individualism that evolved in Northern societies. Because the individualism that came out of Northern societies is kinship individualism. That is, we have our family, our close relatives that we care a lot about, but we don't have these sort of extended kinship or extended family that we care a lot about. We care more about individual traits. So the individualism that evolved in the North was a form of almost hyper-moral individualism, because instead of depending on being accepted thanks to your kinship ties, you are only accepted if you have very moral traits. So you are accepted on the basis of your reputation as a very dependable, and caring and moral person. That is the individualism. And so that is the opposite of the sort of the antisocial individualism that we see on the right, where people, we have an overrepresentation of people who don't care about fitting in. They don't want social acceptance, and so they are higher on sociopathy and so on. And yeah, I haven't read Neil's book, so I'm aware of that it exists, but I haven't read it. But yeah, this is a problem that has not really been discussed on the right. I've been involved, like I said, for 2 decades, and I haven't seen anyone tackle it seriously before I started talking about it head on like this. And I think it's, well, 2 major reasons. Probably some of the people recognize themselves in the description and don't want to talk about it too much. But also the other people probably just find it embarrassing. And we want to talk about the bad traits that exist on the left. We don't want to talk about the bad traits that exist on the right. That's embarrassing. So yeah, I do think there's a reason for it, but I do think it is a topic that needs to be talked about.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to take a hard look in the mirror, right? And without getting black-pilled and, engaging in the kind of self-loathing that characterizes, what identity politics tells us we should believe about ourselves. But we do have to admit what our faults are, because otherwise there's no way for us to kind of grow and to work beyond them, if they are something that's inherent to us. And I think that, yes, there is we do have to take a kind of more pragmatic stance if we're going to kind of get to where we need to go, because where we are kind of at the moment seems to me anyway to be a kind of transitional period where we're kind of moving from the afterglow of 2016, 2017, where, Richard Spencer is getting interviewed on CNN and there's like mainstream interest in the alt-right and everything. And then the hammer drops and we're kind of running and we don't know what to do, how to deal with this. At the moment, we're kind of, we're sort of transitioning into being a more sort of insurgent or guerrilla type movement that has to be able to operate in the underground. And we're doing very well with that. I think that we're actually making a lot of, we're influencing what's going on. But we do have to take this practical tack here in order to, because the movement does need to grow. It needs to grow in terms of what it can do. And it just needs to be able to do things, like to do various practical tasks. Like one of the things, we just released a book by Friedrich List, which is sort of the big bang of nationalist economics. And one of the things I'm sort of doing here after releasing this book, which I think is very important, and it's, other countries like China and, interwar Germany thought it was important too, because that's how they built their economies. I think it's very important to sort of looking at surveying the landscape of the nationalist scene and kind of trying to look around and seeing, well, who's the big economist in our scene? And, it may just be my lack of vision, but I'm kind of drawing a blank here. It seems like there are aspects and sides of even just the theoretical aspect of things that we need to grow into. And we need to be able to inhabit these spaces so that we could take on the other side sort of head on, but also so that we can come up with, just well thought out and considered ideas of what we would do, what we stand for, and what we would put in the place of the idea of one world, globalist economics and everything like that. So, this is something, who are the economists in our scene? I haven't been able to find any. It would be great to attract these kind of people. So what we need to do is we need to be able to actually do things and to be able to reach out and appeal to someone who would, know something about, say, economics. And there's certainly even more like concrete things that we would need to achieve to be able to enter the spaces that we've been exiled from, and to, in some sense, maybe even destabilize these spaces so as to create opportunities for our guys to, make something really happen, entryism and all that kind of thing. So I think this folds into the ongoing discussion about the primacy of theory versus praxis, which is kind of the last thing I had on the agenda for us to discuss, where most of us on the nationalist scene, we agree on the praxis, but the theory is more contentious. And it seems to me that, even though I said toward the beginning that if 10% of the population holds an unshakable belief that it, basically will dominate the discourse in society, that probably praxis is actually upstream of the theory. So that's just my take on it. I, certainly can elaborate on that if you'd like, but I'm more interested in Froði in what you think. Like, should we be kind of trying to hammer out the nuts and bolts of what we believe first and then start doing things? Or is the doing of things, the practical and pragmatic aspect, is that upstream of the theory, or is there a sense in which the two can be reconciled?
Well, I agree with you that, there aren't many economists on the radical right. There aren't many people talking about economy. And I think that's, for a very obvious reason, that we're not really in a position to determine the policies of any state. So it's very abstract. It's sort of like there's an old quote that we'll interior decorate when we have extinguished the house fire, and it's sort of like economy is or economics is a part of the interior decoration stuff that comes later, and now we have a sort of a demographic problem, and certainly, yeah, I agree that we don't really have a lot of people who talk too much about economy. When it comes to the practical stuff, I made a video recently about retribalization, and essentially, or a speech. I gave a speech. It was actually earlier this week. I gave a speech at a conference in Estonia, and the premise of the speech is that I see this challenge that we have in front of us, this paradigm shift that needs to happen. I see that in terms of a very large change that needs to happen, a very fundamental paradigm shift, a revaluation of values that may take generations. And I don't really think that we're going to, anytime soon reverse the demographic damage that is going on throughout the West. I don't see that happening. And so in terms of practical terms, in terms of what we can do practically rather than theoretically, I don't think that we should, first come up with a perfect theory and then just implement it. That's not how humans work. We're never going to end up in a stage when theoretical work is over and we're done, right? Because that's when we're dead. We have to always, that's a part of our nature. We may not like it, but we have this Faustian part of our nature where we have to sort of challenge and go beyond and so on. That can sometimes be destructive. That's sort of it's sort of like Wotan, right? You can't control what Wotan does. It's sort of a force that just, it can make us great, but it can also destroy us. And I think that's a part of the Faustian nature that even on an intellectual level, that, we have to go beyond, we have to challenge, we have to think. And that's what made us powerful beyond our numbers in the West. And so I don't think that there will ever be a point when the theoretical work is over. So I don't think we can wait for that. And I do think that the big challenge is to create living communities. And that was my point in my recent speech earlier this week about retribalization, that I'm envisioning development in terms of non-political, and I want to stress that, non-political communities developing with people just living a tradition or living in a community with a spiritual direction or and there are two things that I want to mention, and there's a lot that I could mention, but two things that I just want to mention about that is that it's non-political, and that means that the goal is not to change the overall power structure or to influence the political power or to influence political parties or anything like that. It's non-political. You don't want to change the world beyond yourself. This is something that you do for yourself, not in order to change the world. So non-political communities, you can call it tribes, you can call it what you like, but I call it retribalization. That I think will happen, that there's a sort of a detachment from what's going on, and we're prone to feel responsible for everything that happens in the world, and we have to change it and so on. But I think there's time for us to focus on ourselves and how we live our lives, because things are bad, and we're not going to be able to turn things around overnight. So I think the next important step is a non-political community building where we can, and the goal of this, of course, is to make sure that we can have decent lives, right? It's not about changing the world. We're alive now, and if there's a change that might or might not come about, a paradigm shift that might or might not come about 2 generations from now, well, what do we do now? Well, we have to live now. So we have to have communities of people with similar values. Otherwise, we're going to go insane. If you're isolated and you're surrounded by people who are not like you in any way, that's going to drive you mad. That's going to drive you insane. So this kind of community building is something that I think is going to happen. And like I said, one of the characteristics is the non-political aspect, that this is something that you're doing for your everyday life. It's not something you're doing to change the world or anything grandiose like that. The other thing is that there will be multiple of these communities, reflecting what you said earlier, or the question you asked me earlier about the different approaches or the different attitudes that people have. You have pagans and Christians and all a wide variety of people with different values who are alienated from the modern world. And I think that for that reason, we'll have different directions and different kinds of these non-political communities, non-political living communities that will develop. And so I guess the point is that I don't think we're going to change the overall structure anytime soon. So we have to find a way to just stay alive and live within the current way that things are. We have to stay alive within the current system. And that's going to be the big challenge going forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think what we need to do is look at ourselves as a kind of nation in exile, as white Europeans, and as a folk more broadly. And I'm very encouraged to see that this kind of thing, the idea of the practical aspect of developing social communities in real life that can support each other. I'm glad to see that this is being discussed in multiple spaces. It's not just us. It's not just you and I who are talking about it now, nor on your podcast. Or there's many other places and other people who are discussing this. And I regard this as a very, very healthy development. I was listening to your podcast on Guide to Culture with Stephen McNally the other day. And one of the things that I heard him, I think the word that he said the most in that whole interview was becoming. And I was taken by that, because we as Northwestern Europeans, as Germanic peoples, are always striving and overcoming. We are Odinist. We in our bones, we embrace change, and we have to change. So, thankfully we can, and we are the people who are going to be able to do that, if anybody can. And this retribalization, I've only listened to the first about 15 minutes of your speech myself. I was very impressed with it so far, but this is something that we've discussed, Joel and I, on the Imperium Cast. I believe it was Imperium Cast 8 with Dave Martell. The idea of the clan as a sort of insurgent, or as a structure, not only to enter into liberal spaces to destabilize them, or to do things, but also just to survive and to be able to, make ourselves anti-fragile as a people. Other peoples are very much more tribal than we are. I think some of that has to do with historical reasons that can be undone. TLDR, these things are not permanent, and that we are able to retribalize ourselves. I think that comes very natural to us, and it's just top-down pressure that sort of keeps it away from us. So, I mean, humans, not just us, all humans are social in general. We are ultimately irrational beings. You and I talked about this on your podcast when you had me on, that you talked about yourself being a Schopenhauerian. I talked a little bit about Pareto. I think they're barking up the same tree, that humans are pre-rational, and we need to network. We need to do things in real life. We need to shake hands. We need to see each other in meet space, give each other, a slap on the back. And friendships need more than just abstract PFPs on our Twitter profiles. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you on, Froði, because you know all about that. You've run the Scanza Forum. I regard that as an excellent piece of work, and it's an honor to speak to you. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Is there any sort of last words you want to leave us with before we go?
No, I think this has been a great conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think it's I agree with you with what you said. We're stateless, and we are, and I think we have to expect we're going to continue being stateless. One thing that I said in a speech that I gave, it's not recorded, but it's a speech that I gave in 2015, when it was my opening remarks for a conference that I organized in Stockholm in the beginning of 2015, and I said that the way I see us is the way essentially the Jews in Europe saw themselves in the late 1800s, before political Zionism even existed. It was a stateless people, and they had this vague dream of one day they'll maybe have a state of their own, but that's not now. And I think we're in that position that, we have this vague dream that we have a state that looks out for us rather than wanting to, harm us or replace us. A state that works in our interest, and that's a vague dream. And we have to live now. That's the important point, and that's why conservatism is the opposite of what we need. We're not in any position to conserve anything. We have nothing to conserve. We're not defending a state that is our own, and we don't want it to change. No, that battle was lost at least 75, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. That battle was lost, and now we're in a situation where we just have to have living communities again and survive. So thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great pleasure having this conversation. It was a great conversation we had when you were on my show. So I hope we'll have conversations again soon in the future.
Yes, very much so. Thank you for coming on, Froði. I would recommend everybody go subscribe to you on Gumroad. All of the links to Froði's social media are in the description. We've recently released a book, so go buy that. That link will be in the description as well. And once again, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.